Guys, here's part two of your notes. Remember when we ended, we were talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and how this would allow for popular sovereignty in both Kansas and Nebraska to decide the slavery issue. Nebraska wasn't a big deal. It was far enough north that it was going to be a free state. Kansas was a different issue. It was right there beside Missouri. And so you have people who are anti-slavery and people who are pro-slavery that really want to sway the vote whichever way they believe is best. So when it came time to hold the election, or not the election, hold the vote for whether or not they should be a free or slave state, a lot of Missourians enter Kansas illegally to vote. These people, like I told you, were called the border ruffians. And Kansas only had 3,000 registered voters, but 8,000 votes were cast. In one spot, only 20 of the 600 votes that were cast were legal votes. And in the end, the pro slavery side wins that vote. Anti slavery people refused to accept these results. And so they hold their own election and create their own anti slavery government. So we end up with two different legislatures within Kansas. The president at the time, President Pierce, only recognizes the pro-slavery government. And this pro-slavery government ends up passing the Missouri slave codes, one of which allowed for the death penalty to be put in place for anyone found helping runaway slaves. They also put in place a law that said that you didn't have to be a citizen before you voted. So all of those illegal votes were made legal. Um, so we have these two governments, and of course, this is going to cause conflict. We're going to get the nickname Bleeding Kansas at this time. There's lots of different acts of violence that are going to happen. I'll give you a couple here. There was a pro-slavery sheriff who was trying to arrest anti-slavery settlers, and he was shot. And so he went back to his community and comes back later with 800 men, and they attack the town. They burn and loot homes and shops. And so then, in response to this, a man named John Brown, who's going to do something later as well, he gathers 7 men and they go to a pro slavery settlement and basically take these 5 pro slavery men and boys out of their houses and kill them. They kill them with broadswords. And so there's widespread violence that breaks out in Kansas. And just some statistics for you: 200 people are gunned down during this time. Property damage is in the millions. The federal troops are sent out, but that's not enough to stop it. Eventually, it will come under control, and eventually, um, once the South secedes, Kansas's constitution will go into effect and it will be a free state. But it has a really rough period there. And to kind of connect to this, the influence of this violence spills into the Senate. There's a man named Charles Sumner who was a abolitionist senator, and he is speaking in the Senate denouncing, saying how horrible this pro-slavery legislator in Kansas is, and specifically calls out a fellow senator named Andrew Butler for his part in this. And then a few days later, Andrew Butler's nephew walks into the Senate, walks down to where Charles Sumner is sitting, and beats Charles with a cane until he is unconscious. Now, their desks are nailed to the floor, so it's hard for Charles Sumner to get out. It takes Sumner 3.5 years to recover, and he's never completely recovered. Southerners see this as kind of awesome, and they send Preston Brooks canes to support him. Northerners say, look, this shows you how inhumane and brutal these Southerners are. You'd have to be inhumane and brutal to allow slavery to happen. Another big thing that is going to happen before the Civil War is a Supreme Court case. It is the Dred Scott versus Sanford case, but I need to give you a little background to who Dred Scott is so that you can understand the results of the case. Dred Scott was a slave for an army doctor and had been taken around. If you're in the army, you move around from time to time. And so they at one point had lived in Illinois, in the Wisconsin Territory, where slavery was illegal. And sorry, there's a typo there. Scott had sued for his freedom because he had lived in those free states at one time. And the case ended up in the Supreme Court. Now, something that's interesting is that Dred Scott was allowed to get married, and both he and his wife did sue for their freedom. But the only way that they could do this was with the help of abolitionists and people who were a part of the church that wanted to help abolish slavery. So anyway, they sue for their freedom. It ends up in the Supreme Court, and the court basically puts a smackdown on Dred Scott. They say you are not free, and you are not free, A, because you shouldn't even be in this court. You are not a citizen, so you do not have the right to sue the federal court. B, you are property. The Constitution protects property. People can take their property wherever they want to go. So, like people can take their couch whenever they move, they can take you as well. But they went even further. The Chief Justice, Supreme Court Justice Taney, um, in his decision, went even further than deciding specifically on Dred Scott. He said that Congress does not have the power to prohibit territory or prohibit slavery in any territory. And so basically said the Missouri Compromise, null and void. You can't do it. And then that whole idea of popular sovereignty, kind of null and void as well. And so basically, he said, you can take your slaves wherever you want to. And so states that are free states, hey, go ahead, take slaves there. No big deal. The South is elated by this decision. Slavery can spread wherever. The North is stunned. They think, oh my gosh, there's no way to stop slavery. How are we going to do this? And more abolitionists are going to join the cause and think, we're going to have to do something big because the law is not going to help us stop the spread of slavery. Um, Another thing that is going to kind of play into us getting into the Civil War and making a name for somebody that's going to help us get into Civil War is something called the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Um, of course, Lincoln is Abraham Lincoln, and he is battling Stephen Douglas, who we talked about before, whose nickname was Little Giant. They are battling for the Illinois Senate seat. And so their biggest issue that they are going to be debating is whether or not slavery should be extending into the territories. And Lincoln gives a speech where he says, and you might have heard this quote before, he says, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And then he goes on later and says, the government cannot endure permanently to be half slave or half free. And so Stephen Douglas uses this quote to say, look, Lincoln's a radical. He wants racial equality and he wants to end slavery. And so Lincoln challenges him to debates. And they hold 7 debates. These debates are 3 hours long each. And Lincoln attacks Douglas because of his idea of popular sovereignty, which leads to Bleeding Kansas. Lincoln is considered the winner of all 7 debates, but he does not have the name recognition. And so Douglas ends up winning the election. However, this gets Lincoln that name recognition that will get him to the presidency very soon. Our last thing to look at, you know that name, John Brown from Bleeding Kansas. Remember, he and 7 others killed those 5 men and boys that were pro-slavery. Now he's going to be heading back north. And so he's driven out of Kansas after that attack. The attack was at Pottawatomie Creek. And he returns to New England, where he decides to come up with a plot. He has to do something. He is a staunch abolitionist who believes firmly that slavery must end. And so he decides that he's going to try to inspire a slave rebellion. And so he leads a group of 16 white men and 5 black men, and they go to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, where they are planning to raid the federal arsenal. And the plan is that they're going to raid this arsenal, and as they are raiding this arsenal, the slaves will join them. The slaves in the area will join them, and they will arm those slaves, and they will have an uprising. This doesn't work, okay? He and the men are able to get into the arsenal, but then they are quickly surrounded by the militia. And eventually, Robert E. Lee and the US Marines come and they are able to storm the engine house of the arsenal, where they end up killing many of the people who came with John Brown and they capture John Brown. Um, Brown is convicted of treason, murder, and of inciting a slave rebellion, and is hanged. And the South sees this as, look, even more people are trying to um, launch an assault on our way of life. How can we continue to be a part of this country? Well, there were mixed reactions, honestly, by people who were abolitionists. There were some people who thought, yes, this is what we have to do, and others who thought, that is crazy. That is not the way we end slavery. And so they're going to have those mixed reactions. So you have a lot of different things that happened that are leading us into the Civil War. I hope you have a great day. Bye.